Good morning to those of you here in the audience, and to everybody around Australia, it's good afternoon, and to those of you who are dialing in from New Zealand, good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this Implementability Super Webinar. My name is Paul Cohen. I'm a gynecologist and researcher in Perth, and today's webinar coincides with the publication of a guidance document which has been produced by the Impact and Implementation Reference Group of the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, or ACTA. And it's on optimising implementability in clinical trials, and we're very excited about it. It's live on the ACTA website and downloadable, and it provides guidance on the planning, design, conduct and reporting of clinical trials so that the evidence that they generate is optimised for implementability. And we're going to hear all about what implementability is and how we do this from Professor Steve Webb very shortly. Before we start, I'd just like to cover off some housekeeping items. To those of you here in the audience, the exit is through the door at the back. Bathrooms are just outside of the foyer to the right. There's food and tea and coffee served in the foyer outside straight after the webinar. For those of you who've joined from other sites or dialed in online, there's two options for you to listen. The default is the audio speaker, which is on the audio pane, but if you'd prefer to dial in by phone, then there is a dial-in option, and the platform allows you to do that. You can submit questions via text, but if you have a burning question that you'd like an answer from Steve today, then sending questions by text, we're not going to be able to answer those. So if you text a question, the answers will hopefully be given in the next couple of weeks on the ACTA website in a newsletter, but there will be opportunities for questions at the end, and I'll explain how that's going to work in a minute. Just a couple of other things to say. Today's presentation is being recorded, and your participation in the webinar is your consent to be recorded. I'd like to thank St John of God Subiaco Hospital for hosting the event. I'd also especially like to thank Anne Wilson at ACTA and Heather McNaught and May at St John of God, who put a huge amount of effort into bringing this to you, and also to Cheyenne Harris and Laurie Gonzalez at GoToWebinar, who are streaming the event so that we can all take part. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Steve Webb. Steve, many of you know, is a senior staff specialist in intensive care at Royal Perth Hospital and also here at St John of God Subiaco Hospital. He's clinical professor of UWA in the School of Population Health and a clinical professor at the Department of Epidemiology and Preventative Medicine in the School of Public Health and Preventative Medicine at Monash. He is a very experienced and highly respected clinical trialist with over $100 million worth of competitive research funding. And in fact, he told me that in this year's NHMRC clinical trials grants, he was personally a CI on 15% of the entire grant funding. He's published over 160 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA and the BMJ. He is a founding member and past chair of the Australia and New Zealand Intensive Care Society ANZIC's Clinical Trials Group. He's currently vice chair of the International Forum of Acute Care Trialists, which is a network of the world's ICU-based investigator-led clinical trials networks. He's a member of the executive and chair of one of 4 working groups of the International Severe Acute Respiratory Illness Consortium, which aims to provide a coordinated global clinical research response to emerging infectious diseases, including potential and current pandemics. So we're actually very honoured that he's here and has time today to give this presentation. Steve is a founding member and he's current deputy chair of ACTA, which is a representative organisation of investigator-led clinical trials networks in Australia. And it's a great pleasure. We're really honoured to have him. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Steve.
Thanks very much for that introduction and those very kind words, Paul. Paul, would you mind just passing me that important piece of paper which I left behind? Look, it's a great pleasure to be talking about a topic which I think is actually incredibly important, which is designing and conducting and reporting clinical trials in a way that optimises their capacity to have value to the community and to society. I want to start by just outlining a few sort of broad brushstroke concepts about the healthcare system and where data and evidence from randomised controlled trials fits within the healthcare system. That was the ACTA banner collapsing. And I don't seem to be able to advance slides at the moment. All right, fabulous. Oops, now we're going too far. That was a wake-up call. I think it's clear and self-evident that high-quality healthcare is really critical to society from two perspectives. The first is that patients want to get the best possible treatment if they're unfortunate enough to be unwell, and society also pays in this country around 10% of gross domestic product to support the care of patients who have treatment. And so there's this double requirement of the healthcare system to both be high quality with respect to the treatment that is provided, as well as efficient with respect to the use of resources. High quality healthcare has moved over many decades to be increasingly evidence-based and are universally regarded that wherever feasible, the best evidence is derived from randomised controlled trials because they deal with confounding, as a consequence of randomisation, a process that is not available to any other type of evaluation or generation of evidence. And so this is a diagram that has been part of ACTA's existence from almost its very beginning. The tri-Venn diagram with three circles. The green circle comprises research and clinical trials. The purple circle reflects healthcare practice, policy and stewardship, and the blue circle relates to clinical quality registries. And so there's a virtuous cycle here in which the role of randomised controlled trials is to generate evidence about the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of interventions, which are transferred into health practice and policy, and registries then have the role of evaluating and measuring whether or not those interventions are appropriately implemented into clinical practice. The registries also serve as the pump primer of this circle, of this virtuous circle, because evidence about variation in practice serves as a way of identifying important clinical questions that can feed into randomised controlled trials. And RCTs are then critical to transitioning from where we might have been a long time ago with an opinion-based healthcare system to an evidence-based healthcare system. But RCTs in isolation are necessary but not sufficient. There's a critical further step, which is the actual evidence generated by those clinical trials being implemented into practice and policy. Without implementation of the results of clinical trials just serve an academic exercise to generate knowledge. It is only through their actual application of those results into practice and policy that they can have any actual impact. So the ACTA Impact and Implementation Reference Group was established almost 3 years ago, and it has the broad remit of seeking to improve the impact as well as the implementation of clinical trials that are done by the member networks of ACTA. It's got a diverse, dynamic and varied membership, and in particular I just want to highlight the extraordinary amount of support and leadership that has been provided by the co-chairs Sally Green and Chris Levi, as well as Sophia Zungas, who was the initial co-chair. There's a substantial amount of work has gone into this document. And it really is the case that this has been a working group that has functioned extremely well together, attending meetings, some face-to-face, some by Zoom, and working continuously to improve documents as they've been produced. It's probably also important to say that despite the diversity of this group, this reflects a relatively limited pool of people with their own ideas, thoughts and concepts about the way clinical trials should be conducted and the results implemented. And I think that there will be some aspects of the guidance document for which there is disagreement. And I think that that's great. I think it's an opportunity to discuss those sources of disagreement. And we certainly regard this as a living document capable of being iteratively modified and adapted over time. And there may even be some things that we've missed out completely, which are really critically important to implementability. And if you identify those, please let us know so that we can improve the document. There's a couple of things which I just want to refer to with respect to scope. The first is that those fundamental building blocks of clinical trial design that are regarded as essential for internal validity are regarded as being out of scope with respect to implementability. There's an assumption that those elements that are necessary for internal validity will always be incorporated within design. The second issue that I want to identify and highlight is that of issues related to equity. Equity permeates clinical trials, or should permeate clinical trials and healthcare delivery. And there are many aspects of equity that are directly relevant to the implementability of trial results. And where there's a direct connection, the issues related to equity have been incorporated within the guidance. But there's an enormous number of incredibly important things related to equity that fall outside the rubric of implementability, and their omission is not in any way a reflection of their importance. So there are some key concepts that I think are really important as fundamental building blocks to then work through the specific elements of the guidance. So evidence is defined as information to guide decision making. And we talk about an evidence-based medical system. What we're really talking about is that clinicians, consumers, policymakers all have access to evidence to guide the decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's not unreasonable to indicate that the ultimate purpose of clinical trials is to generate evidence to inform and, where appropriate, change clinical practice. One of the things which the reference group identified as it was working through this process relates to nomenclature. And what it is that within each of our sort of little Galapagos-like islands in different clinical trial networks, we often use the same terms to have different meanings. There's a WHO classification of what a phase 1, 2, 3, 4 clinical trial is, but they don't necessarily apply well to some types of investigator-initiated studies. They apply much more to where the purpose of clinical trials is to obtain a registration of a licensed product. To try and deal with the differences in understanding of the term clinical trial phase, the reference group has adopted the use of two terms. The first is an early phase clinical trial, and the second is a late phase clinical trial. And it doesn't relate in any way to whether or not whether the trial is evaluating an already licensed product or not. And it also allows for the wider gamut of clinical trials, which might be evaluating an intervention which is not a pharmacological substance. It might be a surgical procedure or a device or a psychological intervention or a policy change, to all fit within the same framework. So an early phase clinical trial doesn't really have clinicians or policymakers as its end user. An early phase clinical trial is learning something about the potential value of a candidate intervention to determine whether further trials are warranted. Its main end user is other researchers and other trialists. As such, one of the pitfalls that can sometimes occur is the inappropriate implementation of early phase trials which have not really been designed with implementation in mind. In contrast, a late phase clinical trial is a clinical trial intended to estimate the effectiveness of a candidate intervention in comparison to alternative interventions or standard practice, and in large enough groups of people to provide precise and applicable estimates of the effects, both positive and negative, on health outcomes. And there's a key difference with respect to the end users. The end users of late phase clinical trials are the people who make decisions about healthcare. They're clinicians, consumers, policymakers. And there's no clear relationship as to whether an intervention is registered for this particular indication. We define implementation as the sustainable introduction to or removal of an intervention from clinical practice or policy. And so implementation may or may not be appropriate following the completion of a clinical trial. It's critically dependent upon the actual results of the clinical trial, and importantly to emphasise the critical role of evidence synthesis as a vital step towards implementation into practice and policy. There are some clinical trials which are sufficiently large and definitive to be regarded as sufficient contingent on their results to warrant implementation, but there are a great many trials that have smaller sample sizes or other issues related to their design and conduct, which makes synthesis with other clinical trials the most appropriate way of determining whether implementation should occur. I see lots of examples of inappropriate implementation in my own clinical practice, but appropriate implementation is an important concept. It's a decision about whether it's actually appropriate to implement a candidate intervention and should be informed by a body of evidence of sufficient certainty, and that's often a systematic review. And this decision should consider the balance of likely benefits and harms and applicability of the evidence to the relevant context, acceptability of the intervention, resources available, feasibility of implementation, and other considerations such as equity. And that then leads to this awful word which we came up with, which we couldn't come up with a better one. It's a pretty clunky term, but the term is implementability. And so implementability refers to the characteristics of the design, execution, a reporting of a clinical trial, typically a late phase trial, that determine the capacity for the evidence generated by that trial to be actually used for implementation to improve outcomes. So implementability is an inherent characteristic of the trial design, execution, and reporting that is not contingent on the results, whereas appropriate implementation is critically dependent on both the results and the implementability of the trial. Wow, I'm not sure that I had anticipated trying to talk my way through this diagram, but let's have a go. The place to start is here. Well, no, let's start with a hypothesis. I think someone told me during an MPH that that was always a good idea. So there's a hypothesis about whether an intervention can do this, create better health and more efficient health outcomes. But it may be reasonable to divide hypotheses regarding candidate interventions into two categories. The first is interventions that are novel or experimental, largely untried, with some in vitro or animal evidence of potential effectiveness. And the other is a much broader category referred to as comparative effectiveness interventions. Comparative effectiveness intervention is defined by having all of three criteria. First, the interventions must be part of the spectrum of existing standard care. Secondly, all of the options must be known or believed to be safe and effective, because otherwise they wouldn't be part of standard care. And thirdly, it's just not known which of those options is best. For novel or experimental interventions, it's quite appropriate for an intervention to progress into early phase clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2 type trials. Whereas for comparative effectiveness interventions, these things are already part of the spectrum of standard care and can go appropriately immediately into late phase clinical trials. It may be necessary to do feasibility and pilot trials in both of these pathways. So there's a large body of late phase clinical trials occurring. Some of these have to leave the pathway of late phase clinical trials via licensing, because that is a necessary step for them to actually be available in clinical practice and policy. Irrespective of whether the pathway is via licensing, the next step is to evidence synthesis, including understanding aspects of implementation science that are relevant. There's then roles here for evaluation of cost effectiveness and health economics, for the role of implementation science, which is something which is incredibly under-resourced, and the importance of which is insufficiently acknowledged and understood, all ultimately leading to the development of clinical guidelines and policy decisions. These can then lead to the actual decisions made by healthcare practitioners, by consumers making decisions about their healthcare, by healthcare systems managers and regulatory authorities. And this then leads to implementation and better, hopefully, healthcare delivery and a more efficient healthcare practice. To take you back to the tri-Venn diagram around which ACTA builds itself, there is then measurement of practice, which can be often done by registries, but sometimes by administrative data or other mechanisms. And this identifies variation in practice, which feeds back into hypotheses. So RCTs are continuously feeding into the end users of evidence, which for late phase clinical trials are consumers, clinicians, and policymakers. All within this landscape of evidence generation and decision making about healthcare interventions. So the ACTA guidance document on implementability has probably taken about 1.5 years to produce. I'm told that it's available on the website. Perhaps when the pandemic passes, we might even think about trying to convert it into a journal article for submission. But a few of us are a little bit busy just at the moment. So the objective is to provide guidance on the planning, design, conduct and reporting of clinical trials so that the results are optimised for implementability. It's both quite a long guidance document. For those of you who need bedside reading late at night, it'll definitely get you off to sleep. But there's a cut down version, which is a checklist, which I hope will be a very useful document as you go about making decisions about clinical trial design and conduct. We think the document's useful for those who design and conduct trials, but also useful to the end users of that evidence, to consumers, clinicians, and policymakers. I just want to go on a slight tangent for a moment and acknowledge that there is quite substantial overlap between implementability and two other concepts, which I think are both really, really valuable concepts, that of the pragmatic clinical trial and that of the embedded clinical trial. And so there are features of each of these three components that are unique. There are features that overlap very substantially, but it is often just subtly different that the purpose for which a particular feature which overlaps amongst those three areas is being utilised within a design can independently and separately influence any of implementability, the pragmatism of the design, and how embedded it is into routine clinical practice. In developing the guidance, you'll see that it is divided into three elements: the trial planning phase, the design and conduct phase of the trial, and the reporting phase. And then within each of this, there's around sort of 6 to 8 major components within each of those. So these are the sort of headlines which I'll work through with respect to the planning phase and propose to just start working our way through them. So I think a really, really useful thing to do at the beginning of when you first sit down to think about a clinical trial is to be quite explicit about defining who the intended end users of the evidence are. Frequently, that will be clinicians, because clinicians are probably the prime drivers of decision making within the healthcare system. But it's also important to identify if an intervention is going to be critically dependent on, or the uptake of an intervention is going to be critically dependent on decisions by policymakers or healthcare managers, and also critically important from almost all aspects of implementability to understand the candidate intervention from the perspective of patients and health consumers and regard them as a core end user of the evidence that will be generated. But if you can't convince, if your evidence is going to be insufficient to convince your end users, then there has to be something fundamentally changed in the way that you are planning the trial. And really important to understand that different sets of end users have different preferences, perspectives and values, and all of those need to be understood and incorporated in understanding how the end users will utilise the evidence. There are really two important options with respect to how that process occurs. One is consultation, the other is co-design. I'm a stronger advocate of co-design than I am of consultation. That means that end users are an integral part of the clinical trial team that is designing and conducting the study. If there are no clinicians that are involved in the trial team, there should be clinicians. If there are no consumers that are part of the trial team, then there should be consumers. Important to understand the evidence needs and requirements of end users. I come across trials from time to time in various fora in which I come away with the impression that the trial is well designed and asking a question that is not relevant to end users. So the question has to have traction. It has to be capable of changing practice and policy. It's also important, particularly in comparative effectiveness clinical trials, that the choice of comparator is clinically appropriate. And that is really only something which clinicians and consumers can provide advice about. In terms of designing a trial, there are many aspects related to the methods for the delivery of the intervention, which are absolutely critical to the capacity for implementation. I'm reminded of a clinical trial that I had heard about, which was a postpartum intervention for young mothers, where both the trial and the delivery of the intervention would have required them to spend 2 hours a week leaving home and coming to a location to receive a therapy. That's not going to work as a clinical trial, and it's probably not going to work as something that can be implemented into actual practice. But possibly the most important of these from the perspective of end users is the choice of endpoint. If an endpoint has meaning for end users, it is much more likely to be regarded as having a high degree of implementability. An endpoint that has little or no traction or meaning or substance as far as end users is concerned is very unlikely to actually result in change in practice. Another concept which I think is very important to trial design is the concept of the minimum clinically significant difference. And it's particularly important where if a trial was to show no difference between interventions A and B, the intended interpretation would be to say that there is no material difference between these interventions. And so this has traction, particularly where symptoms and function are the endpoint of a trial, and engagement with people with lived experience of the disease is critically important for defining the minimum amount of change in those symptoms or function level, which they would regard as significant and sufficient to warrant implementation of the intervention. Another area where the broad concept of minimum clinically significant difference is important relates to the public health impact of the disease that is being studied. A disease with high impact and high incidence has great impact on society, and as a consequence, the minimum clinically significant difference that will result in more lives saved or better lives lived can be very small, and that has implications to the amount of statistical power that is appropriate for those sorts of studies to incorporate. The next feature for which consultation and co-design with users is very important is that the trial entry criteria are actually going to be applied by the end users when it comes to the implementation of those results. So inclusion and exclusion criteria, which have internal meaning within a clinical trial, actually have extraordinarily important external meaning for the implementation of the results of the trial. The trial entry criteria define the population entered into the trial and are translated directly into the population in which the intervention would be expected to be applied in practice. And so inclusion-exclusion criteria that are complex, long, unwieldy, involve calculation of scores, will be difficult for practitioners to apply in actual practice. And so it's a call for simplicity and ease of applicability in inclusion-exclusion criteria. Australians and New Zealanders have a reputation for being a bit pragmatic. They certainly are in intensive care. And in intensive care, we sometimes want to do clinical trials in which we identify a relatively sick population, even amongst those patients who are admitted to an ICU. A registration trial of a therapeutic substance did that by requiring calculation of the Apache 3 score. That's a score between 0 and 70 something, which requires about 90 data points entered to determine how sick you are. In the ANZIC CTG trials, we say to the clinician, if you think there's still going to be an ICU the day after tomorrow, that's sufficient to enrol. And it identifies a very similar population. They're all good for pragmatism, embedding, and implementability. But you can just transfer directly the idea that if your clinician thinks a patient's sick enough to be in ICU the day after tomorrow, the results of this clinical trial apply to this population. Clinical trials don't occur in a vacuum. They occur in a complex landscape, and context is incredibly important. Good trial design often starts with an observational study in which practice is just measured in representative locations to understand various things that contribute substantially to being able to design a good clinical trial. You get to measure the incidence of the primary outcome, which helps with power calculations. But where particularly interventions are part of the spectrum of standard care, part of that observational work should be to measure the different frequency with which alternative options are provided. And that serves to ensure that the options that are part of existing standard care are the ones that are actually going inside the trial. Where it's a new intervention that's being evaluated, critically important to provide a control comparator which is actually reflective of standard care. I think I've seen clinical trials, perhaps not done by investigator-initiated groups, where the comparator is sometimes chosen because it might not be very good. And that doesn't really help with respect to implementability. Sometimes trials are done, and one of the reference group members who's probably online hates this word, de-implementation. The withdrawal of something which is part of existing standard care because it's ineffective or harmful. More important if it's experimental. But where things are suspected to be ineffective or harmful, there's a really important place for clinical trials. Where a clinical trial is being contemplated where there's an existing treatment that's part of standard of care and it's not certain whether or not it works, but there's no evidence of harm and it's not particularly expensive. I would suggest to you that conducting a trial to determine that an already implemented intervention is effective is an academic and not a practical exercise, because the end result of that is confirmation that it should continue to be implemented, and it's already implemented. I'm not sure how much that advances improved outcomes. It also exposes patients to risk. There's a whole gamut of research activities to assist in determining appropriate context. Observational studies that I mentioned, but also surveys, focus groups, qualitative work. In intensive care, we sometimes do clinical trials in which we ask our colleagues to do quite complex things, to follow an algorithm or to change ventilator settings. And qualitative work at the very beginning to understand whether or not it's even feasible to get them to do those things can be extremely valuable. Which is really the purpose of pilot studies of feasibility, which was on the next slide. And I just want to put in a plug that pilot trials of feasibility are incredibly important, and there's sometimes a habit of not necessarily publishing them. And I think that's problematic for two reasons. The first is that other researchers won't know that the intervention wasn't feasible, and they may be tempted to do unfeasible clinical trials. The other is that it's got direct relevance to implementability. If you, despite all of the resources brought together in a clinical trial, can't deliver an intervention, it's got little or no chance of actually being implemented in clinical practice. We had a late additional member of the reference group who has provided enormous value to the reference group, someone from the TGA, who pointed out that for many interventions, it's a critically important step is actually licensing. This doesn't necessarily apply so much to investigator-initiated trials, but it certainly can. And there are many things that need to be planned at the outset if a TGA application is intended as the endpoint of a clinical trial, and liaison with the TGA or other regulatory authorities is highly desirable to ensure that the trial is designed and conducted in a way that will be regarded as sufficient. So I've already referred a little bit to the composition of the trial team. There are many aspects which contribute to implementability that are not necessarily picked up by the traditional design, traditional team composition with statisticians and clinical investigators. I sincerely believe that all clinical trial teams should have a consumer as a key member. If clinicians are not part of the team, they should be. If an intervention is going to be implemented through change in policy, I think it's really important to have policymakers as part of the team. Health economics are a vital component, and they need to be included at the design stage, because there's often many aspects of the health economic analysis that it's not possible to go back and do if it hasn't been planned at the beginning. And the last is a plea for much greater involvement between implementation scientists and clinical trialists. Clinical trialists sometimes perhaps just see themselves as having a responsibility that stops at the end of the evidence generation process, but I think they need to think much more, and in partnership with implementation scientists, about the next step of how these things change and improve clinical practice. One of the ways in which end users are more strongly integrated within the team to promote implementability is by trials being developed, planned, proposed, discussed, conducted within a clinical trial network. It's almost always the case that clinical trial networks have a strong clinical membership. In the ANZICS Clinical Trials Group, we meet twice a year. None of our projects can be submitted for funding if they haven't been presented to our peers. If you stand at our meetings and propose something which makes no sense to the clinicians, that is fed back to you quite rapidly and appropriately. Many of the CTNs, but not all of them, have really done fantastic work in terms of engaging with consumers. Many of the cancer networks do this superbly. The musculoskeletal network does it superbly. And the quality of trial that emerges from those networks is vastly enhanced by the consumer contribution. I think because of the engagement of clinicians and consumers, there's almost always within clinical trial networks this embedded focus on designing trials that are as implementable as possible. But of course, when it comes to actually implementing the results of the trials, when they've been conducted by a community of practice that includes clinicians, consumers, and policymakers, there's a direct pathway to facilitate translation. I've got no evidence to back the assertion that trials done by networks are better implemented when appropriate than other trials, but I strongly believe it to be true because I know it's true of my own discipline, where almost instantly the ICU community changes practice on the basis of the trials that we as a community have prioritised and conducted. The last component of the planning stage is a little bit novel, and it is the suggestion that notwithstanding the wonderful nature of the Spirit guidelines, that there should actually be an additional section within trial protocols related to issues that are relevant to implementation. And so this can include an explicit identification of the trial as a late phase trial. It can include explicit identification of who the intended end users are, and it can record all of the things that I've been talking about in terms of the issues related to choice of target population, the choice of endpoints, and how they relate to implementability. It could also include pre-specification of how different results should impact the appropriate implementation of the results, identification of enablers and barriers to actual implementation, and plans for contribution to evidence synthesis and subsequent measurement of implementation. So moving on to the design and conduct phase of the trial, and you'll see that there's a few of these elements which cross a little bit between planning and design and conduct, and we've made somewhat arbitrary decisions as to where they lie. The results of a trial apply to a population, and so the trial sites that will recruit are critically important to implementability. If they're highly specific, then there may be uncertainty about the extent to which the results can be applied to a more general location. So an intervention that can only be applied in a tertiary or quaternary hospital setting, of course, must be tested in a tertiary or quaternary setting. But an intervention that's intended for community practice really shouldn't be tested in a hospital clinic. It should be tested in the population receiving care in the way that they would, in which the intervention would be delivered. With respect to trial entry criteria, there's sometimes a natural temptation for clinical trialists to narrow down the population as much as possible in a way that is designed, they think, to try and find the best population to give themselves the best chance of having a trial with a positive result. And there are many situations, particularly in early phase clinical trials, where that's appropriate. But every time a trial population is narrowed, the population to which it can be implemented is similarly narrowed. And if at all possible, keeping the population broad, or as broad as would be expected to potentially benefit, is a really important design characteristic. If there's a really high a priori likelihood of differential treatment effect within different components of the population, the answer is often not to restrict criteria, entry criteria to one of those subpopulations, but to stratify the randomization so that there's separate clinical trials happening in each defined subpopulation, which can be pooled if appropriate. There are many aspects of screening and recruitment that impact on implementability. In general, designs that are pragmatic or embedded, where it's routine clinical staff who are screening and recruiting, are much more likely to be identifying populations that are as reflective as possible as the population to which the results would apply. I think the general theme through here is to just try and do the trial as much as possible as it would occur in actual practice if the results of the trial warranted implementation. In this way, there are features of the way the trial intervention is also delivered. We want to know if the intervention, to implement it, we want to know if the intervention works under the conditions that would occur under actual practice. There's a landmark ICU study that shows better outcomes if patients once a day have their sedative medication switched off and are allowed to emerge from the induced coma that has been applied. That trial used a separate research team to go to each bed space each day in the units in which it was being conducted and to switch off the sedation. So it wasn't being done by the bedside nurse, who would actually have to do that in practice. And so we don't know if the way that the intervention was delivered, when it's being delivered by a separate research team, is actually going to work when it's done by bedside staff who have multiple competing priorities. And there are many examples of where the way the trial intervention is delivered in some ways are different, sometimes fundamentally different to the way that the intervention would be delivered in practice. And when that occurs, there is immediately a gulf of uncertainty about whether or not the results will apply in practice. So best, if possible, to train the clinical staff who would be delivering the intervention in actual practice to deliver the intervention in the trial. And then, of course, there's confidence that the intervention can actually be delivered by those staff, and the training material that is necessary to deliver in actual practice already exists and has already been road tested. A lot of clinical trials, and not necessarily inappropriately, have a lot of processes to optimise adherence or compliance, which are different to those that would actually exist in clinical practice. So a clinical trial might have a run-in phase where no active drug is being administered, but there are some processes to determine if a patient is going to be compliant with taking the medication and adherent to other aspects of the measurements that are necessary to evaluate the trial protocol. But of course, when a clinician comes to evaluate those results, they don't know whether the patient sitting in front of them is one who's going to be compliant and sufficiently adherent. And it's also the case that sometimes, for appropriate safety reasons in a trial, aspects of the design that relate to adherence, compliance, and safety are unlikely to be replicated in the real world, leading to uncertainty about capacity for implementation. And a wonderful example of this is the use of potassium-sparing diuretics in patients with heart failure, in which the pivotal randomized controlled trial that showed substantial improvement in outcome had quite frequent measurement of the trial participants' serum potassium and renal function, and they were highly observed within the context of conducting a clinical trial. The trial shows benefit. There's a big spike in prescription of these medications, which is wonderful to see in terms of actual implementation of results of the trial, and a corresponding observed spike in admissions to hospital and deaths from hyperkalemia, because the intervention was being delivered in a different way in practice than it was in the clinical trial. And the adjustments or titrations of the intervention should be those which are capable of being delivered in actual practice. This is not to say that there isn't a staged process by which in an earlier phase it's first demonstrated the clinical and biological activity of the intervention, but necessary before implementation can occur to evaluate the intervention in wild type. The choice of comparator is particularly important for implementation. The comparator has to have clinical meaning to the people who are going to apply that evidence in practice. There's so much variation in clinical practice. It really makes your life difficult as a clinical trialist, finding suitable comparators if all of the clinicians do different things. Because if all the clinicians do different things and you compare protocolized A versus protocolized B, all the clinicians will say, well, I don't do protocolized B, so I don't know if these results apply to my practice. And there's often little, sometimes that's a fundamental and difficult to overcome problem. Observational data before the trial to identify the commonest form of standard care is one way of generating the comparator. Another way is defining some form of intervention and allowing clinicians to do what they would normally do in this situation as the comparator. But that only provides an average comparison between what all clinicians do and doesn't allow for the possibility of variation within that spectrum of standard practice. And sometimes that's led to 3-arm trials with each of those groups. Blinding and placebo are critically important in almost all circumstances, but there can be occasional examples of where blinding and placebo can detract from implementability because blinding and placebo are not obviously part of routine practice. Health economics needs to be built into trial design and conduct wherever there's a relevant health economic question, which is almost everywhere. And as I said before, that requires incorporation of appropriate data collection, which can't be retrofitted at the end of a trial. And it's a rare breed of people who can do this work. Health economists are in extremely high demand because of the skills that they bring and critical to implementability. Couple of other aspects to consider. One of my colleagues in the UK, who's an ICU researcher, runs many of her clinical trials embedded within registries. And what she's able to do in table 1 of a randomized controlled trial is report 3 columns of data, which is unusual. She's able to report intervention, control, baseline variables, as most trial reports do. But the 3rd column is data from the registry for patients who are eligible for the trial but are not randomized, including from other sites. And it's just a wonderful way of providing population context to demonstrate that the control population is very representative of the actual population into which the results would be applied. For complex interventions, things which aren't simply drug A versus drug B, but they're processes of care or algorithms or targets, or psychological interventions or physical therapy. All of these interventions can and should be tested in randomized controlled trials, but process and fidelity evaluation in parallel with the way the intervention is being delivered in the trial are critically important and contribute to understanding how the results can be actually translated into practice. So I'll move last to the trial reporting phase. And many of the aspects of the implementability document lean very heavily on the tidier checklist for the reporting of clinical trials, which has been a wonderful resource for the group. Moving through them, it's absolutely critical that there's a commitment to timely and complete reporting. It's a widely recognised problem in clinical trial science, that clinical trial registration now being essentially mandatory everywhere in the world, that there are a large number of trials that sort of disappear into some vacuum and are never reported, and uncertain as to even whether or not they've completed recruitment. So all clinical trials, irrespective of whether they complete, should make some public statement regarding their completion. And it's actually really, really important from an implementability perspective where the trial fails because of recruitment or failure to deliver the intervention, because they're directly relevant to implementability, that is made as placed in the public domain. Particularly for complex interventions, it's critically important that the intervention be described in sufficient detail to allow application into practice. And this is where the tidier checklist is incredibly useful, and also entirely appropriate that whatever study materials are used during the study to implement this complex intervention in the trial are then made publicly available to facilitate implementation of the intervention into practice. Other aspects of reporting which I think are important to implementability include being prompt and complete with responses to contribute to evidence synthesis. It's only by the pooling of multiple trials that we can make more rapid progress, and of course willingness to contribute to individual patient data meta-analyses. There's a complex issue going on at the moment about accessibility of results when they're published in medical journals that are behind paywalls. Many funders are now requiring some form of open access, and particularly where end users are consumers rather than research professionals, ease of access to the results is obviously of great importance to implementability. And I think the last element that I'm going to mention is it's very important from the perspective of implementability that the investigators associated with a trial, this is as important for investigator-initiated trials where academic conflict of interest can be extraordinary as much as it is for commercial trials, to have complete and transparent declarations of interest. So this is a simple diagram, a clinical problem. A clinical trial generates evidence on optimal treatment, progresses through evidence synthesis into implementation, into practice and policy. Implementability is really a body of work that impinges on the clinical trial stage to make sure that the results of the trial that are going to be generated are as implementable as possible. So ACTA define impact as the change in health outcomes or health system productivity, or both, that arises from the implementation of evidence, including clinical trials. And obviously, implementability is critically important to actual impact. So I'll finish with a quote from a relatively controversial figure, Michael Ioannidis. In order to be useful, clinical research should be true, but this is often not sufficient. So thank you very much for your attention.
I'd like to thank Steve for a really terrific talk. And what we're going to do now, just a quick summary of how we'll work this is, we're going to start with questions from the audience here at St John of God, Subiaco and Perth, and then we're going to visit each city. And we're very aware of time differences, so we're going to, when we're finished here, the first site that we'll visit is Otago and then Auckland, and then we'll come back across the country to allow people where it's getting late. So we've got some microphones in the audience, but Steve's going to repeat the question for the benefit of everybody that's online. So if there are any questions from audience members here, please feel free. We'll probably have time for 2, maximum 3 questions. Question here.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm just curious, a lot of what you described in terms of the evaluation of the appropriate implementation sounded like health technology assessment, and you never used the term. So I just wondered if there was a reason for that, and if there were discussions within the group sort of similar to the ones that happened with regard to the importance of regulators in the conversation.
So there were two questions. One was, if I correct me if I've got any of this wrong, but the extent to which there's overlap with health technology assessment, but we didn't use the term. And the other was involvement of regulators.
Involvement of health technology assessments in the conversation.
Yep. So we have a great deal of respect for the health technology assessment that exists in the UK, which often starts with a clinician or policymaker generated question. And I think many of the principles that apply through the HTA process overlap very substantially with what we're talking about. It's just a little bit different in this country because there's much less in the way of calls for specific research or the available or somebody, NICE has a role in terms of feeding things into the HTA assessment, and it's much more organic. So I think a lot of the structure that has evolved over a number of years and is very, very good within the HTA process hasn't necessarily translated quite so well. But the omission of the term was not meant in any way to diminish its value and its contribution. And the other question was?
Just whether you had a discussion with the group about sort of early dialogues with HTA with regulators.
So I don't know that there's, at least in this country, something that's comparable, which creates that that barrier. To some extent, I think the health translation networks, the RTECs and the CIRHs, are intended to have that role, and I think they're very active in trying to adopt that role. And it would certainly be wonderful to see, whether it's through RTECs or some other process, much greater engagement from policymakers who have questions that they need resolved, whether it be MSAC or PBAC, or just hospital CEOs aware of changes in practice or budgetary implications, having a pathway through to the clinical trial community.
Time for another question. Okay, there's, oh, sorry, that's a question. Yep. I'll just bring you a mic.
So I guess it's not so much a question, but I do agree with you about running trials in their native clinical setting for its maximum implementability. But I think there are, I don't know what the statistics are, but I think in order to run research and to run trials, we often need extra resources in order to do that. So I think that's quite a difficulty, but particularly when you're running trials which have large numbers of patients that they have to recruit.
Yeah, look, I think I think the question was related to the logistic complexity and expense of running trials where they're intended to be implemented in the way that they would be in practice. Does that capture the gist of it?
Yes, basically. I think it's hard to be able to implement that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure that can be true. I'm certainly aware of a number of models of conducting trials in which that's actually used, the embedding of the trial in routine practice is used as a way to minimise the cost and resources. So there are groups who do trials in which routine clinicians undertake screening and recruitment. And then it's the routine clinical staff who deliver the intervention. And all of those can and should be supported by the healthcare system. Indeed, within the ACTA Guidance on the costing of clinical trials, there is a statement that indicates that components of standard care that are occurring within a trial, including the interventions of the trial, shouldn't be costed separately to the clinical trial.
Okay, we've got time for one more question from our audience here. And if there's no further questions, then we will move on to Auckland. And if you do have a question that you don't have an opportunity to ask, then you're very welcome to email or contact Steve through ACTA. So I think we're ready now to go to Auckland.
Hi there. We just have one question. Consumers who engage can often have vested interest. How do you engage with consumers who really reflect the general public in ICU, those who have not yet had any experience of needing ICU care, but may at any time?
So I'll deal with the second part of the question first, which is ICU has probably been the worst discipline for engaging its consumers. Very few people know in advance that they've got an upcoming intensive care admission, and quite appropriately, most have been through don't remember it and don't want to remember it and want to get out of the place as quickly as possible. Nevertheless, we have found a few people who often people who have very long admissions and spend long periods of time, for example, with a tracheostomy, and get to know ICU better than is advisable, who do want to be engaged. They have a particular perspective, and I think one of the challenges for clinical trials is understanding the range of values and preferences that come from consumers, which is sort of a bit of a segue to the first part of your question, which I think is challenging. Would certainly acknowledge that. But I think like a lot of things within clinical trials and within clinical trial networks, governance, processes, procedures are important. And so written guidance about how consumer feedback occurs and processes for identification of consumers that seek to promote a diversity of views, and then processes that allow all of those views to be articulated are steps that can go in the right direction. I'm aware internationally of some efforts to engage consumers in the design process has not always been as successful as it might be. And I think it's really important to identify those elements of design where scientific literacy and understanding is critical to decision making, from those where consumers have the only valid perspective, which is around the lived experience of the disease, which is critically important to acceptability of interventions as well as the relevance of endpoints. I think a great example of that is the OMERACT system in rheumatology, where a very, very impressive consumer engagement process has occurred now over several decades, which has led to a complete revision of the endpoints that are used in rheumatology trials, because the trials that were done decades ago would do things like count the number of inflamed joints as an endpoint. And the feedback when it was eventually available from consumers was that that wasn't of any great relevance to them. What was relevant to them was how much they could do, how fatigued they were, how functional they were. And so that led to much better metrics and much better trials with better impact and better implementability.
Thanks very much. Any further questions or comments from Auckland? We've got time.
We do have one more question. In addition to uptake and implementation of evidence by the healthcare providers, interventions also need to be accepted by the community, and different aspects of the community may view this differently. How do you ensure that minority groups, for example, are also engaged in a way that makes the evidence implementable to them as well?
Sure. Look, I think that's a critically important aspect. And it reflects the importance of diversity in the consumer engagement process, and the particular importance that exists with engagement with groups that are socially disadvantaged, or groups that historically have had little voice due to language differences, and particularly important for trials involving, not just trials involving Indigenous participants, but trials in which the results are intended to be applied to Indigenous communities where culture is different. I've never particularly done trials personally that have focused on Indigenous people, but I do know people who do, and they tell me that it's a long, slow process to learn how to do these things, and something which requires years, if not decades, of dedication to doing well.
Thanks very much for those questions. Sorry, my apologies. Do we have any questions from Otago? Otago? Hello? No questions from Otago. Okay. So we'll move now to Melbourne, and we have plenty of time, so welcome, Melbourne.
Thank you, Paul.
Any questions for Steve? Any
Hi,
questions
Paul.
for
Sally, just checking you can hear us.
Yes, very well, Sally.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I'm sitting here in St Kilda Road with a group of people, and we don't have a camera, but hopefully you'll be able to hear. I'll repeat the questions if need be. Marina, I think you have one. Did you want to go first?
Thank you. Yes, I do have, well, more of a comment. I think these guidelines look really fantastic. I am a little bit concerned about dividing clinical trials between early phase and late phase. I tend to feel that there's a whole sort of spectrum of research that is done between the does this warrant more research and the we're ready to implement it phase. And I'm wondering if that is sort of going to get lost in your classification.
I think if I'm allowed to rotate back to who the end users are, if the end user is other researchers to do more trials, that's sort of more akin to what a pharma company would regard as phase 2. Phase 3 trials or late phase trials should have endpoints that are patient-centered. It may be that that the sample size in the initial late phase trials is insufficient to warrant appropriate implementation. But I would still think that the categorization that you are intending to generate evidence that is applied often via evidence synthesis together with other trials to policymakers, clinicians and consumers is a valid distinction. Look, I'm sure there is some element of spectrum, and to some extent the description is artificialized to try and make the concepts clear, where in practical application there's a little bit more overlap.
Okay, other questions?
Yes, more questions, please.
No one jumping up and down here, so I'm going to ask one if I may.
Please do.
Steve, just thinking about the other components of ACTA's guidance and other reference groups. You've talked a little bit about engaging consumers. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit or signpost some of the other links that people may be able to draw on as they try and learn more about this or spin off from this guidance.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. One of the challenges that I think that ACTA has faced in the last couple of years is the need to sort of create working groups to work on a chunk of definable or hopefully definable work, whereas in reality all of these things are integrated. So there are other ACTA reference groups that interdigitate directly with this piece of work. There's a consumer reference group which has done a lot of work about developing a toolkit and processes to facilitate efficient and effective consumer engagement. And then there's another group which also interacts somewhat, which is a prioritization of research question reference group. There are emerging fantastic tools, particularly around those that make some effort to calculate value of information, which can be applied where there's a long list of potential research questions to identify those that should have the highest priority.
Okay, thank you. That's it for questions from Melbourne. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Sally. So we're going to move now to Sydney. Come in, Sydney. It's like the Eurovision song.
I was trying to work out what it was, but it is the Eurovision, isn't it?
Any questions from Sydney?
So, good afternoon, good morning, wherever we are. So, yeah, so you can see us here in Sydney. We've been listening intently, being very patient. So thanks, Steve, for a great talk. I haven't even introduced myself to the people. My name's Chris Levi, and I'll just sort of facilitate here. So over to the audience. Now, I think we have a roving mic, and Deng will take that around. So give Steve your best and hardest questions. Feel free.
Thank you, Chris.
So while they're thinking, Steve, I think you touched on the issue of engagement of clinicians in the design and consumers in the design, and you mentioned the importance of health service management and having the custodians of our healthcare budgets involved in some of these important, particularly the comparative effectiveness research questions. What do you think we can do better in that space, and what's been your learnings over the years in terms of involvement of our friends who are the holders of the purse strings in healthcare in this process?
Look, it's something ACTA's talked about since its very inception. I think we've, at one level, got good engagement around with the Department of Health around the clinical trial sector, its needs, its aspirations. We've got a new process with the involvement of the Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare with respect to clinical trial governance and trying to get clinical trial sites as efficient and effective for the conduct of clinical trials. And that side of engagement, I think, has been absolutely fantastic. Where I think we've had less success is exactly the area that you're talking about. We've advocated without necessarily a great deal of success, and Paul Glasiou has advocated for this for a long time and written about it. The idea that the committees that make decisions about availability of an item number for a medical benefit as part of the MBS, or for subsidy of a drug that's available through the PBS, could have available an option that exists that lies between approval and rejection, which is availability of the drug or the item number within a registry or within where appropriate, within a clinical trial, so as to be able to generate more evidence and allow them to, in a couple of years, make a clear decision as to whether the best interests of the community are served by approval or rejection. We've done our best to disseminate that concept. I think it is a great idea, but I don't necessarily know enough to know if that's the case. What I am told is it would need legislative change, and legislative change is always difficult and complex. I think at another level, Chris, there's great opportunities, particularly through the RTECs and the CIRHs, to have much stronger dialogue between health system managers and clinical researchers. I think there are some healthcare managers who have perhaps unfortunately only a more limited understanding of clinical trials. Perhaps they have a good understanding of commercial clinical trials because they generate income for hospitals. But one of the things that ACTA really wants to try and push, and I know ARA does as well, is that we're not part of the problem, we're part of the solution. The healthcare system has a lot of, does a wonderful job, but it does so with a variety of strains and a variety of challenges, many of which can be solved or improved with better evidence. And often the clinical trial networks, as you know, both your network, the stroke network, as well as the ICU network, have a track record of doing clinical trials that achieves the double whammy of better health outcomes at lower cost. And I think we've somehow failed to articulate this effectively to health system managers. And I really think that the RTECs and the CRHs are a great way to try and get that engagement.
Thanks, Steve. Good answer. So we have a question in the audience. Just introduce yourself and they'll respond.
Hi, I'm Jonathan from the University of Sydney. This has been touched on, but I just want to push it a bit more about the engagement of the clinicians and implementing therapy or the intervention into regular workflows. I think that's great and really important for implementability. But my experience with healthcare professionals is that it's extremely difficult for us to already standardize practice, let alone get them to standardize a clinical trial. I know it's different for every setting, but do you have any tips or tricks that would be helpful for people in the audience?
Yeah, look, I think that's really a great question. I probably, in answer to Sally's question, should have also mentioned the embedding reference group as being critically important to those aspects which are related to trying to get screening, recruitment, delivery of interventions occurring within the routine health system. I think there's a number of levels at which to try and provide a little bit of preliminary advice. I think networks that comprise clinicians do this better because they can wear their hat as an investigator and their hat as a clinician and have a better understanding of what their clinical colleagues will or will not be prepared to do. Aspects of the trial design like inclusion-exclusion criteria that are easy to interpret are critical. Having passion and enthusiasm about the promise of the value of the evidence is important. Just a couple of brief anecdotes that don't necessarily help answer your question, but they do shed a little bit of light on it. When the ICU community many years ago now did the SAFE study, which was a blinded randomised comparison of 4% albumin and normal saline for patients in an ICU who needed volume resuscitation, there were big stacks of fluid in the research office called SAFE fluid, and the registrars didn't have to do anything other than write up SAFE fluid on the IV chart once a patient was randomised, and they found that pretty easy. So much so that when the trial stopped, some of them continued to write up SAFE without even having realised they were part of a trial. So that's successful embedding. The other aspect is about engagement with clinical colleagues. One of the things which has sort of quite marked ICU trials is the extent to which the answer that the trial generates is not the answer the community was expecting. And so that served to be very useful at generating equipoise and uncertainty and an appropriate questioning of things that we do at the moment. One of the ways that we do that is every year when we have our main meeting, we typically first present the results of our major trials back to the group, and we do that as a tribute and an appropriate acknowledgement of the group before they're presented at international meetings or published. But we have a show of hands as to what the people in the room think the results are going to be. And the fact that more times than not the room is wrong compared to the actual results of the trial has been incredibly useful in generating awareness within the broader clinical community that you can't make assumptions about what treatments are effective, and we need trials, and it creates a sense of community about generating the evidence.
Less leaks than the current federal cabinet by the sound of it within your network. I have another question. I'll just try and manoeuvre that so they can see you up there.
My name is Peter Sestouli. I'm from the University of Sydney. I'm sure everybody on the call agrees that randomised controlled trials produce the best evidence, but there may be scenarios where randomisation is unethical. And I wondered whether the Alliance has produced any guidance on alternative designs, for example, observational study designs with propensity score matching to try and account for confounders.
So great question. The short answer is no, but there's certainly widespread acknowledgement within ACTA that not everything can be solved with a clinical trial. It's not just in some situations unethical. There are situations where it's not feasible for a variety of reasons, including for rare diseases. There's some really neat observational methods. There's also some Bayesian designs that can generate something with very small sample sizes. It's not really something that ACTA have approached from a policy perspective. There is a statistics interest group, and that this might well be something for them to consider. But certainly within the leadership at ACTA, the point you make is strongly acknowledged.
Chris, it's Paul. What we might do is just keen to give other sites that we haven't been to yet an opportunity to ask questions. But if you've got more questions, we may well have time at the end, so we can come back to Sydney.
No, I think we're right. I think we've exhausted the pool.
Thank you very much.
Proceed.
Terrific questions. So we're going to move on to, we've got 2 sites in Brisbane. The first one that we're going to drop into now is QUT. So welcome, QUT. Any questions for Steve?
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, very well.
Okay, right. So hi, this is Sam. I've been hosting here at QUT. So I'll just ask I'm trying to share the webcam as well. Thanks very much for the presentation. Very, very good. Is there any questions from the audience? People are saying no, but just while maybe some people are thinking, I do think the previous question was one for the audience, and so that was very useful to answer that. But Steve, you touched on the area of the comparator, and I wondered if you wanted to embellish. I remember reading in the document that you talked about maybe doing an average of the comparator therapy, or using a wild card or something like that. Did you want to just talk a bit more about the ability to look at comparators?
Yeah, hi Sam. I rushed through that a little bit. I'm sorry. For complex interventions, for treatment algorithms, strategies, there's many complexities associated with the choice of comparator. Some of which have been really quite controversial in the United States, with the federal government having a view in the US. So one example is, let's say you're interested in trying to work out what the ideal target oxygen saturation is for newborn babies. And one way that that has been tackled is to do randomised controlled trials where there is a target at one end of the spectrum of standard care and another target at the higher end of the spectrum of standard care. But what that does is sort of quite artificially not just dichotomise, but dichotomise and separate large amounts, excluding large amounts of the spectrum of standard care. So you do get an answer as to whether the top or the bottom of the spectrum is appropriate. But that design doesn't actually answer the question as to whether there might be something in between, which is even better than either extreme. And also, in setting a target and holding a patient to that target, it ignores the possibility that a clinician who might choose varying targets for different reasons based on individual patient characteristics, both between patients and within a single patient over time, might produce better outcomes. And so these are real challenges for trial design science. There are some designs that would allow you to evaluate across a range of options, but the wild type control would just be, or what's referred to as the wild type control, is just continuing to allow clinicians to do what they would normally do, which is to sort of personalise the therapy. The problem with a clinical trial from the perspective of implementability is that when wild type wins, you don't really know how to implement that because it's just an amalgam of what every clinician does currently. And it's entirely possible that there are variants within wild type that are better. You know, from one perspective, it does advance the cause. You know that setting a specific target is worse than allowing the clinician to choose the target, but there's a whole heap of research to be done to try and work out within allowing the clinician to set the target, what are the best targets. All good trials.
Thanks very much. Any more questions from your group in QUT?
No, you've answered a number of questions along the way. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're now going to move to Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane. Welcome.
No questions here at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to Adelaide. Welcome, Adelaide.
Hi there. Thanks, Steve, for a wonderful presentation, and we'll see if we've got some questions here. Any questions, folks? Steve, you don't get off scot-free, because I'm going to ask a question. So I want to know about, should we, in view of various funding schemes coming up shortly for trials, should there be an implementability rating scale that HMRC and MRF implement?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question, but what I would say is if you read the current category descriptors for the NHMRC clinical trial and cohort scheme, there's actually quite a lot that that relates to the potential impact of the trial on health outcomes, which in turn I think probably does reflect back on implementability.
Thank you. Any other questions from people here? I think that's our start. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And so our last site is Darwin. Welcome, Darwin.
Thanks. Can you hear us?
Over. Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. Any questions for Steve?
Hi, Steve. It's Alan Cassidy-Menzies. Are there questions in the room?
Hi,
Alan. Steve, you talked about the critical involvement of health economists in studies from the inception as one of your aspects of implementability. They remain a sort of breed that are rare, and one, I can think of trials that have been conducted incredibly rigorously in terms of the trial conduct, but have been followed by almost laughable modelling of the impact or what the findings mean. I'm just wondering, is ACTA contributing to sort of a similar rigour and development of materials and building capability around economic analyses and modelling of the economic impact in relation to the results of trials?
Yeah, look, there are nowhere near enough of them. They bring enormous value to the clinical trial enterprise. I don't know that ACTA can or has particularly done anything structurally to promote the development. I am aware of a few things that are happening within some of the RTECs to promote access to health economists. It's a great community, quite a good community of health economists within the country. I think they're working hard to train PhD students and get more of them available. But they bring unique skills, and in their absence, even planned economic analyses often lack key elements which can influence their validity.
You talked about research conduct in the context of engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous communities. Clearly, around our table in this room are people who do that every day of their lives and careers. And I think there, some of those issues of how we conduct research, those issues that you talked about, co-engagement, right through the training of people to be involved in the conduct of research. But also there are issues that you touched on and raised that we, as trialists, think often just throw out as mantra, like sharing of results that have different meanings when you partner with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. You know, in communities where perhaps results over the last 50 to 100 years have been shared without consent and have had negative impact on communities. So I think in the conduct of research in this context and issues of implementability, you know, there are very fundamental challenges and critical issues in co-engagement that do need to be undertaken to address those issues.
Yeah, Alan, the one thing I'm certain of with respect to Indigenous research is it's extremely difficult as someone who's not closely engaged to have any adequate knowledge. I'm aware of the example that you raise, acknowledge its importance. I think there's a wider debate around the data sharing issues that is yet to fully sort of shake itself out. But I think it's important that you know, whilst the validity of the broad principles are acknowledged, that it's clear that there are examples, particularly that involves sharing of data and information without the consent of cultural groups, where that can cause great harm, which should trump general principles related to data sharing.
I've asked 2 questions or made comment. Anything around the room? No, thanks. We enjoyed it and could hear particularly well. So thanks, Dave.
Thanks very much. So we've finished a little bit early. I think before we finish, I'd just like to ask Steve if he has any closing remarks or comments to make.
Look, thanks, Paul. As a question without notice, I just think if there's one takeaway message, it's that clinical trials are a pragmatic activity. At least for investigator-initiated trials are a largely pragmatic activity. And that means focusing on making them as useful as possible, which means thinking as you run through a design, how all of these issues are going to impact on the potential for the results of the trial that you're conducting to improve health or to improve healthcare productivity, and hopefully both.
Thank you very much. So I think I'd like to just thank everybody for joining this webinar. It's been a great success, and encourage everyone to read the document. We hope that it'll lead to increasing implementation of clinical trials. And just like to put my hands together and everyone here for Steve for a superb presentation. Thank you very much.
I should say, Paul, that it's been a great privilege to be able to present the guidance, but I do want to emphasise that this really is the work of a very large group of people, including yourself. And it's benefited enormously from the diversity of views that have been expressed as it's been put together.
So we'll draw to a close, and thanks everyone again for attending, and to those of you from across the country in New Zealand for dialing in and for your questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Steve. We'll sign off here in Sydney.
Right. Thanks, Chris.